Video game, or VCRs with tape. Folks, do you remember the old be kind, rewind thing? Remember how long it took you to rewind your movie all the way back to the front before you took it back to the DVD? Remember that? The digital natives don't understand that. They don't understand the frustration of sitting there watching a little. They don't understand that. That's us. We understand that. The digital native doesn't understand that you can't just click a couple of buttons and have it jump to the exciting scene in the movie. No, with a VCR, we had to sit there and slowly advance and keep looking back and forth, until we got to the spot. Video games. For us, video games were really in arcades, weren't they, at first? When you wanted to play a video game, you wanted to go play Pong, or any of the games that came out after that. Dragon's Lair, one of the first RPG type ones. There was a whole bunch of different games that came out. So the vector-based ones, asteroids, and all those occurred in arcades. So to go play games, you got off the couch, turned off Gilligan's Island, got mom and dad or somebody to drive you over, and you went and found arcades. You hung out in arcades, and you put lots of quarters in to play those games. They made a lot of money for Konami. Social networking. Do you remember the days of social networking when we were in school? It started with what? Going to a phone, calling your friend who wouldn't be there. You would then need to give a message to their parent, leave a message on the answer machine, or maybe to the angry sister who would never give your message on. Okay? And that was the starting of the process of getting together with your friends, right? The digital native, they just call their friend. In fact, they can text, they don't even have to call. In fact, they don't have to look. Have you seen that? They'll just do it from behind their back. Okay, oh yeah, got a message. Oh, there's the tone ring. Oh yeah, they're there. That's what they do. That wasn't for us. We had so many more steps we had to go through to communicate, collaborate, to meet up, to network, to be interactive, to play games. You see that? See the difference in our experience? That's the same in education too, wasn't it? Think about it. Think about how you were in school, and think about the things you had to use in school, and think about what your world was outside of school compared to what the world was inside of school. I would argue these days that the world that we all had outside of school was not as dramatically different or drastically as different as it is today. Today, I would argue that our students, our digital natives, have a dramatically different experience outside of school than they ever get to have inside school. Digital natives are global. Digital immigrants are regional. Your friends growing up, where were they located? They were near you, weren't they? They were in your school, they were in your church, they belonged on your baseball team, they were a friend of a friend, but that friend was still close to you. Okay? They were very regional to you. In fact, if you had somebody that was a global friend, what would you do? They were called a pen pal, and you usually met them because you were part of a language class or something in school, and you had to write somebody. And so you would write a message in broken German, and you'd put it in an envelope, and you'd put a bunch of stamps on it, and you'd send it. And 6 weeks later, you'd get back this letter that was in broken English, and you'd read it and go, wow, I know people in a global context. I'm a global communicator. Students today have always been playing games with people from all over the world. They've been blogging with people from all over the world. They don't understand having friends just nearby you. It's always been the world. It's always been the world to them. So they don't understand this regional thing that we have, this need to have all our friends in proximity to us. Okay? That's a digital immigrant kind of issue. It is not a digital native issue. So digital natives. So what do they do outside of school? What do they do outside of school? Well, they play games. We kind of guessed that. They play games. They like to download music. In fact, for middle school students and such, this actually becomes one of the #1 things they like to do and do. They do social networking. And I guarantee you, many people they're social networking with are nowhere near them physically. Communications, they do emailing, they do texting, they do instant messaging, And what's really interesting, but it's not surprising when you think about it, girls outpace boys by 12% in that. Now, if you look at the Facebook numbers, you'll find that women typically write about double what men will write on Facebook. Okay. By the way, here's a number for you: 200 million. 200 million. 200 million is the number of Facebook accounts right now. Facebook hasn't been around for long, folks. It really hasn't. 200 million. Okay? 200 million Facebook accounts. And the funny thing is we're starting to see a lot of Facebook junkies. The other thing we're seeing is a lot of digital immigrant Facebook junkies now. Facebook is actually becoming one of the things that's really starting to turn some of these people who were born prior to 1980, getting them even closer to becoming digital natives. If you're looking at the spectrum, you've got digital natives and you've got digital immigrants. I argue that Facebook and the social networking phenomenon that isn't going away, it's not a fad, folks, is starting to bring the people who are engaging with this, are bringing them closer to being what digital natives act and are like. So if you're not doing Facebook right now, if you're not doing any kind of social networking, wow, you're growing that gap between you and your students. You're growing your gap between you and those digital natives, I guarantee you. Digital natives, when asked about the value of gaming and gaming technologies, digital natives said that they believe that games make it easier to understand difficult concepts. Okay? You know what? The military's been using games for years, and it's called simulations. Corporations are doing it. You know? Yeah, you use it to understand difficult concepts. Why? Because you allow people to do a lot of iteration with a concept. Trial and fail. Try and fail. And eventually succeed. Yeah. That they would be more engaged in the subject if it had a game-based approach. Why? Why would they be more engaged? It's interactive. Remember, they're used to having interaction in their lives. Okay? You drop a book on them and say, here, read this book. They look at it, and it's not talking to them. It's not engaging with them. They've always been interactive and immersive. I would learn more about the subject, okay, if they were using game-based approach. And here's something I found incredibly interesting. I, by the way, have a 6-year-old who's very proud to tell everybody he is now a first grader. He just graduated. Is the right term, matriculated? From kindergarten to first grade or whatever. He is now a first grader. And they're saying that number one reason in that age group, they would say they would learn more about the subject. Even at that age, they're already recognizing and wanting game kind of approaches, game kind of technology. Why? Because they've been interactive. My son, because of kind of what I do, I mean, since he's been 2 years old, we've been playing with robots. Since he's been, 3 years old, we've actually been playing video games together in very limited ways, and be careful about what games we play. But we've been gaming together. I had a benefit. My father, when I was growing up, brought computers home to me to play with back before there was even the Apple computer or the Commodore. So, you're depending on the advantages you have and who you know, sometimes you get to see some cool things at a very young age, and it does really impact your life. Teachers who teach digital natives. Okay? What's really interesting now in this report, in this survey, was we're starting to see the teachers starting to care now about games and game technology. I started this company 6 years ago. Okay? I've been on the bleeding edge of this kind of movement, this approach. I have watched repeatedly people just not get why you want to do these kind of highly interactive concepts in the classroom. Really, just right over the heads. What's really been interesting in the last 2 years, we've seen a real acceleration of people now wanting to engage with these kind of technologies in the classroom. And it's really heated up over the last year. And now, as I was telling telling Zini and Jane, that I've now approached this in this past few months by multiple universities now all wanting to start to teach this to teachers. So we're starting to see the trend now. People are starting to get wind of this, and now we're starting to see it move from way extreme craziness to starting to get closer to, oh, well, actually, that does make sense. Craziness, get closer to, oh, well, crazy, actually, that does make sense. This to starting to get started. Crazy, actually, that does make sense. This to starting to get started. Crazy, actually, that does make sense. This to starting to get started. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again. Crazy. True, that does make sense. Yes. To start again.